Today we're going to look at the molecular compounds. So what are molecular compounds? So here it is when you have, let's see on this side, non-metals that are getting together to create new compounds. Now, how does that work? Let's see if we can review some of the work we did with the Bohr-Rutherford diagrams in the past. So if you look here, we have here Bohr-Rutherford diagrams of the first 20 elements. Now, if you have not seen my video on ionic compounds, please go and see it. That was the one that was published just before this one. And what happens is that we know that ionic compounds are made of metals and non-metals. Now, the difference with molecular compounds is that they are made of non-metals. So what's happening here? So if you have non-metals, for example, fluorine has two goals in life: the same number of protons and the same number of electrons so that they can be neutral. But the second thing they want is to have a full outer shell. So they want a valence shell full. So if you think of fluorine here, fluorine has 7 valence electrons. There you go. So it wants one more. What does it want one more? It wants to be as stable as a neon here. Neon is quite a stable atom because it has 10 protons and 10 electrons. And on top of that, if you look at the valence shell, it's full of electrons. So fluorine would love one. If we have oxygen has 6 electrons on the outer shell, would love 2 more electrons to complete the valence shell. So oxygen and sulfur both are in that case. If you take nitrogen and phosphorus, both have 5 electrons on the outer shell. That means that in order to complete their valence shell, they need 3 electrons. So what's interesting is that if you have an ionic compound, we have metals that don't mind giving electrons, and that's why those nonmetals are happy. However, when you have compounds that are made of nonmetals, then it's a bit trickier. So let's see what we've got here. Let's go back to the board. Very nice. So when you have a molecular compound, we do not have any metals. So that means you have compounds such as O2, CO2, methane. You have these ones as well. So here what happens, you have compounds made by atoms that are part of the nonmetals. But if you look at the charges of the nonmetals, they are all negative. So if they're all negative, that means that they all want electrons. If they all want electrons, what happens if there's no atoms willing to give them electrons? So here we have to look at an analogy. So let's say that you have a friend, and after school or after work, you go home and you want to eat apples. You go in there, you get home, you've got 2 people, there's an apple on the counter and an orange. Well, if there's one person that wants an apple, that's great. The other person says, guess what? Take the apple, I'll take the oranges. That means that one decided to give the opportunity for the apple to the other one, and the other one is happy with the apple. However, if you're in a situation here where every atoms want electrons, it's the same thing as if you have 2 friends going home, and throughout the whole walk home, or you after work, you say, all I want is an apple. But you get home, there are 2 or 3 people, they all want apples, but there's only one apple. What can we do? We cannot, if one takes one, it's going to create issues. And therefore, what they will do, they'll take the apple and they will share the apple. So here, when you have molecular compounds, you have a situation where we have atoms that are sharing electrons. So the question here is, how does that work? So I'm going to take an example of, let's see, we can do fluorine. Why not? So fluorine is an element, but never is by itself. But what's interesting with it? How come we have fluorine that is F2 like this? I'll show you. So if you happen to have fluorine as a gas like this, and you want to put them together. What happens here is you have two atoms. But this fluorine here has 9 protons and 9 electrons with actually 7 electrons on the outer shell. Interestingly enough, that fluorine would love an extra electron. There you go. Now, what's interesting with the other fluorine, it also has 9 protons and 9 electrons with 7 electrons on the outer shell. What does this atom want? It also wants electrons. So what do? It's like they have a pact. They will say, how about we share electrons? So what will happen? They will share electrons that will be located right in the middle, right here. So you're going to say, why would they be happy with this one? Keep in mind that the Bohr-Rutherford diagram is a snapshot. It's like a photo of where electrons would be. If this fluorine shares 1 electron with the other one, what will happen? This one now has 8 electrons on the outer shell. However, this one, as soon as an electron is gone to this one, here we have this fluorine atom on the left saying, guess what? I shared 1, and now I want my electrons back. And how about you lend me 1 of yours? So what will happen? Then these 2 electrons will be on that side here. Now, keeping in mind that all electrons are moving at the speed of light, that means they're never going to be right in the middle here. They are moving around like this. So what will happen is that you have a compound here that is very stable because they are sharing electrons. They don't need the outside world for more electrons because here, at any given moment, this fluorine has 8 electrons on the outer shell. This one here has 8 electrons on the outer shell. And here it gives us a stable molecule. How can they be here happy? They're sharing electrons. If they're sharing electrons, they are a molecular compound. How does that work? Well, in order to have a molecular compound, we need to bond together electrons by sharing each other's electrons. So here we call it a molecular bonding. Now, when you have molecular bonding, that means that it's the relationship, the connection between 2 or more atoms. And here we have a molecular bond. The molecular bond is what connects, is what makes a molecular compound stay together. Why? Because there's a molecular bonding between the 2 of them. Now, there's another word that you might encounter as well. It is called a covalent bond. I know that from my experience. This one here is, we've seen in North America and around the world. Often this one is in the scientific world in Europe. Back when I learned about chemistry, that's the one I had, covalent bond. When I started to learn in English Canada, they were talking more about molecular bonds. So both are excellent. So here's the first example we have. Let's see if I can make another example with carbon dioxide. So give me a moment. I'm going to do the drawing. My next example will be about carbon dioxide. This one right here. So what's interesting with carbon dioxide is that you have carbon. Carbon has 6, can we see it nicely? Perfect. Carbon has 6 protons and 6 electrons. So 2 electrons on the first shell and then 4 on the outer shell. Each of the oxygen here would have 8 protons, 2 on the first electron shell, and then 6 on the outer shell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now, how do they get together? The oxygen want to have 2 more electrons. Here, if we think of the carbon would like to have 4 electrons. So that's tricky. And that oxygen also wants to have 2 electrons. So what they have to do, they have to say, okay, if we get together, we will have to share the electrons. So let's see what happens. So there you go. So what will happen is that this oxygen will say, well, in order for me to be happy, I would love if you, carbon, could lend me or share with me two of your electrons. And that's great because if it can lend two of its electrons, guess what will happen? This atom of oxygen here has now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons. That one is happy. That's the same thing happening on the other side as well. You have here this oxygen right here with 6 valence electrons will ask the carbon, if you share with me, that'll be great. And if the carbon is sharing, we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 valence electrons. Here we have an atom that will be happy. Now, what happens though is that if you look at this carbon, it has now 2 protons. Oh, it has 6 protons and 2 electrons. Look how much charged this atom would be. So as soon as carbon shares its electrons, it wants to have the electrons back, saying, okay, I shared 2 with you. Now it's your time for you to share 2 with me. So what will happen? These 2 will be going to the carbon. And look here, we have now 4 electrons that can be for this carbon. And the same thing on the other side. And if you look what we've got right here, you hide this one and you hide this one. You now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons around this carbon atom. So one way or the other, that carbon now has 8 valence electrons. Now you have to keep in mind that electrons are going at the speed of light. So therefore, when you take a snapshot, you can just see where electrons are, but they are moving all the time. So what will happen is that electrons will be shared like this and shared like this. So what will happen? You end up with a molecule that is a molecular compound where together, because the electrons are going at the speed of light, at any given moment, the oxygen, this carbon, and this oxygen will have their 8 valence electrons. But as soon as you are to see 1 electron there, it already is somewhere else because of their speed. And therefore, you end up with a very stable molecule that is called a molecular compound because there's molecular bonding happening. We have molecular bonds or covalent bonds between here, the carbon and the oxygen. And that's how we get the molecular compounds. If you have any clarification questions related to this, put your questions or clarification questions in the comments below. I'm always looking at them, answering them, and using your ideas for new videos to make sure that our community is getting better all the time. On this, I'm going to put here another video where we're going to learn about the review we did on ionic bondings, and I'll see you there.